Join Revolution Radio every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Studio B for Momentary Zen with host Zen Garcia at freedomslips.com, the People Station.
This is Thomas, a.k.a. a Mad Painter. I'd like you to join me Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Open Canvas. Don't forget to bring an open mind.
Yes, folks, that's right. Bring an open mind to an open canvas. Again, that is Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern. UFOs to government corruption. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
We did not engage in conflict that was out of line with our mission.
Is it disloyalty? Is it sedition? Is it treason to oppose the hand of tyranny? Never!
I will never send troops anywhere on a mission of that kind without telling them that if somebody shoots at them, they can darn well shoot back.
I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty! Oh, give me death!
A dark cloud is finally lifting across the world as U.S. military intelligence and their global partners are destroying the deep state criminal power structure that has ruled over our planet for hundreds of years.
We are free with the God-given right, and we shall not yield that right to any power on earth.
Hi, I'm Scott McKay. The world is at, and I am your host on The Tipping Point on Revolution Radio, where every Monday from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern, we bring you the latest in this ensuing takedown of this global criminal empire.
That's an image of strength.
You'll get the raw, hard truth here on The Tipping Point. So come join us Mondays, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern in Studio B at revolution.radio.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We gotta stop them! They're gonna kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Calm down, the thunder will now you
Hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio.
Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. It's about observing cycles, sharing insights, and solving problems together by combining historical, climate, food, and economic data so you can make informed decisions as we shift into a new era. Here's what was, this is what's coming. Our world is never going back to 2019, so what will the new era look like? And most importantly, what is immediate that will affect the pocketbook and the outlook into next year so we can all get ready? Thank you for joining. I'm your host, David DuByne. And I do welcome you this evening, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you reside on this beautiful blue planet in this perfect day to be alive and experience what's being thrown at us. It is a moment of life, is it not? Should be appreciative that you're here when so many are not, to take that next breath. As we move through the times, there's a great awakening happening. The way that the economy is working is so all bare to see now on how fake it is that governments can actually make your life inflate away to nothing by just a turn of a switch and plans to add extra 1 trillion to the economy, take 1 trillion out, add 6 trillion to the economy, take it out on a whim, and make people lose their homes on a whim. Like, you can actually see the plan now in real time where they're so in your face. We're going to do this. We're going to raise the rates. We're going to do this. We're going to cover 1.5 trillion for margin calls on electric prices in Europe. We're going to do this. Well, how did prices get that high anyway? See, the workings in the cogs that we don't normally see in finance are out. Emperor's naked, has no clothes. So as we move through these next weeks, when people's lives become a little more difficult, a little more inflated, supply chains are going to lock up super glue style. Early warning from two people from Europe wrote me and said similar things. I don't get distant early warnings usually. Like, dude, you really need to get ready right this second. Super glue of the supply chain system is coming. And I was like, okay. Well, again, it's a plan. So I'm here with Ransom Godwin tonight, 420 TV, Freedomist Films. And I'll come back to that whole supply chain thing and the grand solar minimum 400-year solar cycle that would be disrupting food production. So now there needs to be explanations for disruption in food production. So when you're taking down all the smelters and all business and manufacturing across Europe, the chemical plants go down, and the ammonia production that produces fertilizer and the urea and the potash, that all goes down at the exact same time. So what we're seeing is, everything you're seeing is a reaction to what would be a natural cycle on this grand solar minimum. The excuses need to come hard and heavy. And I was writing something down earlier. And Ransom, I'll ask if you agree with this. Every single new distraction is faster and more intense than the previous global thing, quote unquote. The time seems to shorten, but the intensity seems to double on each of these distractions. Because, we went from COVID, but actually, if you were following the same finance stuff, which I was back in 2019, you would have seen that the overnight repo market, or the lending market from bank to bank or institution to bank or government to institution, and then they swap within there, and they get like 5.25% per night to get money in there to lend it out. That was in 2019, though. It's probably higher now because inflation, interest rates went up. But it relies on a degree of trust that that company will pay back that bank in the morning, because you're only borrowing it for 12 hours. So, as our world spins, some people go to bed and then the money is not being used. Well, they would swing it into another market for like 8 hours, and then swing it to another market for 8 hours. But the whole thing worked because everybody paid it back after that time period of 12 hours of overnight lending, or 8 hours, whatever it was. Something happened in the middle of 2019 where that totally stopped, where banks didn't trust banks. Governments were like, no, I'm not giving you anything. You're a government, and I don't trust you that you're even going to pay me back. So then it locked up because there was no more like money in that. Think about it as if you're in Vegas or something and you're putting money down on the roulette table. Well, there's money in there that can be taken out if somebody wins. But if there's zero money, you're staring at a blank table and there's not even a single bet. Then what? Then there's no liquidity, is what we would call that. There's nothing in the pot. That would have been the 2019 thing. And then if you were looking at that going, oh, whoa, that's going to crash the markets. Holy smokes. How are they going to deflect from that? This is a global cascade that would be even worse than 2008-9. That was in 2019 when the repo market locked up. So if you were looking at that, then I see COVID come in. But then again, I'm looking at the grand solar minimum 400-year cycle, knowing that the onset of crop loss is occurring right now, where the jet streams and cloud cells will flow to different areas. Cosmic rays will add a different band of clouds from, say, 18,000 to 23,500 feet or so. So now you have all these different variables in the atmosphere, not locked in place because our magnetic field on the planet is weakening. along with the sun's magnetic field. And it does it on a 400-year cycle. And once you see that weakening, you understand that the cloud cells and the jet streams and the new cloud layers from cosmic rays are going to bunch together, and you'll have once in a 1,000-year storms. And other areas further afield got totally rained out, so it's drought. There's no cloud building like there used to be in the normal pattern. Needs to be excuses for that. Now, looking at it from that lens and coming in going, wait, what happened in 2019? They need to lock the planet down so people can't move around. And excuses amok need to come because you are going to go into a famine. It will be in lower developed economies this year, where you're going to see things that you thought were not possible to see on how many countries are going to starve at the same time. And then that'll be the next distraction. See, I'm already forecasting somewhere out in November-ish. Give me a 30-day window. I'm calling a huge thing here. Around November, there is going to be story after story, and all you're going to see is humanitarian aid, just mass famine, just starvation stories across the news headlines. Because what's happening everywhere right now in the immediate term is the biggest distraction ever, because you got Europe locking up, electrical prices, America's going to be following with that. Fed's doing their thing with the economy, but everybody can see it in real time. So now they're going, whoa. We need to do away with your organization because you're manipulating the market. There's no free market. Are you kidding me? You're telling us that they're going to raise the rates to 5, 6, 7%, take $1 trillion off of free money you gave over during COVID to all the companies that enriched themselves and gave the bonuses and the payouts and the golden parachutes and all that. That was all COVID money into the companies. Now they're like, no, we need to pull it back. But where they're pulling it back from is me and you. So you can see the give out there with this quantitative easing and endless money and COVID relief and all that BS that went out there. That was for companies, and they absorbed it all like sponges. It's never coming out of them. They're gone. They're contracting. They can't operate. Not enough electricity. Where's the money coming from to pay back and pull that trillions out of the economy? It's coming from me and my pocketbook and things that I'm paying more for. And Ransom, I'm babbling, man. Thank you for joining me tonight. It's going to be a great show.
Yeah, it does seem like everything's moving at an exponential rate, but it the more that it happens, the more it seems planned, because this just seems to be the perfect time. We've talked before about this new system being set up after whatever disasters, and I was going to say September 23rd. If you've been paying attention to the sun there, we may have some, blackouts from a natural reason, just depending on, if the sun burps like it did when it was facing away. What if it does that here coming up? And then on top of that, that is all you see around the world. There's all that flooding in Pakistan. Imagine the amount of displaced people. I don't remember the number. It's in the hundreds of thousands. And, you keep hearing these once in 100 floods, but then again, the rivers are all drying up, exposing all these artifacts and Nazi ships and, things like that. So there's all of these weird things in the news. And at the same time, they're polarizing, like I've said before, the two-party system in the United States to keep them distracted. It's like a daytime soap opera. And I've joked about this before. Trump is who Trump is. He's been in entertainment. Now, I don't know if it's on purpose or, this is a real drama we're watching, but it seems so made for TV, the back and forth between the government and his lawyers. And, it just seems like they're building up the drama to stall you out until around 2024 on the next election cycle. Then we'll see how weird stuff's going, but it seems like the European Union is about to collapse and become a communist state. Look at all the power grids. Italy is begging, but basically, I mean, they're saying, hey, enough of this. We need the energy, and Russia's saying, we'll let you freeze. We'll turn it off. So you can see this just developing into a kind of a nightmare scenario. This year just might be the first year in several years in a row that people are going to have a taste of famine, no power. I mean, just look what's going on in California. they're threatening the people. It's like holding them hostage with the power at the same time as they're telling them in a few short years you're not going to be able to use gasoline powered anything. Basically, I mean they've taken away like weed eaters, lawnmowers, different things powered on gas. They're making regulations about that, but the whole state saying that people, new cars being sold there have to be electric cars. And then you back up to the present time before they even do that, and they're sending. Well, basically, they're not sending text messages. That's what I was going to say. It's much worse than that. They're actually hacking electric cars, and that shows you how good of an idea it was to have a computer for a car. But they're hacking cars, telling people, you know what, we're not going to let you charge right now. Don't charge because California is, it's peak hours, and we've decided that you can't use your electricity to charge a car up. So just imagine in the future when more and more saps buy into this electric green movement and totally ignore the fact that it's all coming from fossil fuels, which are being shut down everywhere. I mean, it's obvious that the nation states are about to go to war over playing games with the flow of energy. When people start freezing, it's weird that they trained everyone to lock themselves in their house in the past couple of years, and then now for whatever reason, I think they want everyone out of their house because, like you're mentioning, we're coming up to a time where only corporations and governments own property, buildings, homes, etc. Everybody else has to stay on the month-to-month cycle and remain in their place or stay in their lane. But then they're going to add a whole new level of suffering in the feudalist tradition, which is make the peasants suffer. We'll just turn off the lights for a while. We don't care. You'll still have high electric bills, high food bills, but what if your refrigerator ain't cooling the food that you buy? And different things like this. If you're having rolling blackouts or timed periods that the electric companies in cahoots with the green movement have decided to just turn off your electricity for a while, and it just so happens to be at the coldest and hottest times of the year. Not that they're super hot or cold in comparison to history, because we know that's kind of a fallacy, even though you wouldn't know that by scamming through the headlines. According to them, Bill Nye the Science Guy and everybody in between, the Earth is on fire. That's why it's freezing. That's why you're going to freeze this winter if you live in Europe and places. They're turning off all of the energy sources and the foods not being produced, and what there is in circulation is obviously going to disappear at a pretty fast rate coming up. And imagine the gouging that's about to happen, and that all on top of what you were talking about, the biggest transformation of wealth that's been happening. I would say since 2008 actually is when they first started to initiated the actual transfer of funds in all of the various ways. But the supposed attack in 2001 was the kickoff for that, the financial center of the world, the trade centers. And who knows who got away with what and got paid for what then. But all the way from that time to now, that's all it's been, is taking all of the money from what's called the middle class or blue collar workers or whatever you want to call it in all of the first world countries and turning them into third world countries. And then we're in a position to beg for food, beg for power. And what, we're just so happen to kind of switch over to more of a Marxist ideology in all these countries at the same time too. It's like I know you know what I mean. It's like preaching to the choir, but it's so complex. You would think that an AI has to be writing the script at this point. Just to your point about the distractions, the Queen of England dying, and then we're going to have a king who happens to be a big part of the World Economic Forum agenda, which is turn off everything, mask everyone up, tell them where to line up, eat the bugs, etc. It's, kind of like Aleister Crowley described their new age, where the earth had to be covered in blood before they could live in their, fancy Doomsday Wilt age of Horus, the golden time or whatever. I think that's what a lot of these elitists are tripping on. And think about the new king there that's been staying at Vlad the Impaler's castle, And if you go back into their ancestry, you know that they're inbred family that kind of moved in, and they had to change their name over to Windsor whenever they took over the royal line there. There's a whole bizarre thing, and we can get into detail about all of the crazy things that go
Ransom,
along with
can
the
I
royal
stop you?
family. But
Wait,
yeah,
can I stop you for a second? I want you to continue with that, but I want to tell you what I understand about that Vlad the Impaler. So let me throw you the story, because I know you probably know the end of it, and we'll keep going with that. Like, this guy was so nasty, that family lineage, that they wouldn't just go to battle. What they would do is go into an area and invade it, bring the prisoners back, and actually impale them. 20,000 of them were impaled in front of the surrounding the castle. So the army that was marching in to save and try to have a battle with Vlad the Impaler and their armies in there. You know, impaling means you take a very sharpened long stick, like a full-on very young pine tree that's 12, 15 feet tall, and you make a super sharp spike on it, and you stab it through somebody from the bottom up, and it comes up under the top of their roof of their mouth, and it pinches that point there. And they let them sit for like 3 days to die like that. That's what impaling is, and that's what Vlad was all about. And that whole family and that misery and that vibration they made those people put off by impaling them was worse than burning to death for days on end. They pinched every nerve point that you could to cause the most pain in a human, pretty much doing that process. And then they ended up with pinching the roof of a mouth with your entire body weight. It would fracture your skull and dislocate your jaw. And then it would still be hanging there, but your entire body weight would be pinched on that one super central nerve point in the middle of your roof of your mouth there. And they would go, so just at the roof of the mouth and back behind where the eyes were too, there's like this triangulation point there. And once you hit that, that sets off every nerve in your entire body pretty much. That's what they aimed for after they put these people and impaled them, 12, 15 feet in the sky. And when armies, I forget which army, and that's why I'm asking you, Ransom, the army marched up, and there were like 20,000 people impaled right in front of the castle, and it was unbelievable. They made them sick where they actually turned around and didn't even want to fight. That's Vlad the Impaler, and that's the British monarchy a few centuries later. Not even many centuries, a couple hundred years later. So continue. Sorry to break you off, but that's what my story was.
Right, the Dracula family. And you know, it's really weird if you look into it. That town still has a lot of missing children. The little area where that castle's at, and there's a weird whole thing about that castle because it's way out in the middle of nowhere. That wasn't really at a strategic point for any of the royal families and empires, but most of that was about the Ottoman Empire back in the day, like the whole idea of Muslim invasions. Vlad the Impaler was the scary, they weren't going to go through there. I mean, they would come into these fields of the last, portion of the army that went in there, and everybody's, dying and rotted. Some of them still alive, some of them dead for a while. You imagine the manpower that it took to set this up. It's like a scarecrow. But back to King Charles now. He is all into this thing, and he's been like fascinated, like a fanboy into the whole idea. That's why he set up his house up until now. He's been living there. And they talk about the weird stuff that he does, like flopping around in the morning sun, believing that he's being possessed or stuff. And there's another who is that, Tony Blair, also known to do that. He even talked about doing that. So it's weird that these people think that it's not just David Icke. They have said things to indicate that they get filled with not the Holy Spirit, but some kind of spirit. But what's weird is where would you think that someone like Vlad the Impaler would be on a council back in the day in like 1447, and he's in a council, right? It would be like today's World Economic Forum, where all of the supposed rulers of the earth get together and decide what they're doing. And so if we assume that, let's get to what they're saying. They're telling us to eat bugs. They're telling us that we're going to own nothing and be happy. And then, like you were saying, since 2019, you can see it in the financial trends, that these massive amounts of wealth are being moved and that everything is being shut down. And then you get to the supply chain and the pandemic and et cetera. And it just seems like, they let all the cards out at once because they're pulling the plug. And, it's not a conspiracy theory. They say it themselves. It's the Great Reset. It ain't the reset for, humanity. It's the Great Reset on control over humanity. Because at some point, our technology and our knowledge will go to a point, if we're not censored and, we're not under authoritarian regimes, that we would get to a point that we no longer need these rulers. And I know that the royalty knows that. And that's why they've been pushing stories about, relinquishing the throne and kind of, disappearing. But right away, you could see that that's probably not true today, because almost every headline, is saying King Charles and the death of Elizabeth. And, these weren't, super great people. They're behind a lot of things. And, it's funny that the last World War, that family was all tied up in, as you know, the Queen's uncle was a Nazi. And he had to parachute into, England to save the royals' name and stuff. But that's a known part of history, that he was a SS officer himself. That was the Queen's. You could go find right now on Google and find the Queen hailing Hitler as a young child, and kind of, maybe she was just a naive kid, but that's the family that we're talking about there. They're proud to be the family of Dracos. So it's real interesting where this is about to go as far as a world stage, because we're supposedly all at each other's throats. But you notice Putin is telling Europe.
Wait, stop. Hold on a second, Ransom. How do you see it going?
Yeah.
Like, can you phrase that? Like, this whole move from queen into a king, like, okay, keep going on the thought there. So where do you see it going because of the shift from a queen to a king?
Well, he's a military person. That's why he likes to, wear all his medals and think about this. His dad is the guy that said he wanted to come back as a virus and kill 99% of the population. Yeah. So, I'm not saying he's like his daddy exactly, but he seems to be like his daddy. He even looks like him now that he's getting older. But no, I think he's not going to use his position as the King of England. He's going to use his position of the World Economic Forum to push these agendas that we got going. And one of those agendas is to remilitarize Europe. Actually, Germany just announced that, with Russians' actions, even though they're side dealing and then trying to publicly act like they're not going to deal with Russia, because without Russian gas, Germany's up the creek. But they seem to want to go another path. They're going to remilitarize Germany. So there's another cue about what's going on, and they're dumping more money in the Ukraine. And you can see the United States is doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down. Every month they're giving the Ukraine more money, more weapons. So this is turning into the same old. It's what just happened in the Middle East, but they're going to do it to Europe and the United States now. And I'm predicting over here we're going to start having severe civil problems, because I see everybody pushing that. That's in the establishment, and then they got all their parrots following them. Blaming the other side, saying the other side of people want a civil war. Well, obviously, Americans don't want a civil war, or we would have had another one since the last one. But they're still going to keep pushing that idea. In Europe, it seems to be easy to light the fuse, though. They just push all of the countries against each other. When I was in school, they called that a shatter belt situation. And isn't that exactly what happened when the Soviet Union broke up? It shattered this whole area back into multi-factions, or what they used to call the Balkan right there, and they're all balkanized right now, ready to go to World War III. So I'm ready to see the sides being picked. Italy seems to be wanting to side with Russia because they want energy. I'm predicting right here in this year you're going to see some kind of like the floods, once in 100-year things that nations are going to start proclaiming. And I've been paying attention to like the Solomon Islands and the South China Sea. All these countries are denying U.S. ships entry to their ports. And also in the Central America, some really weird stuff's going on. I don't know if you saw that article about the GPSs are all being, cloned, and they're telling them ships are going in different places that they're not going. And then on top of that, as you know, a lot of people don't know that there's lots of pirates out there around Somalia and in those areas that are constantly taking ships. And it hasn't changed. Actually, it's been increasing because of all the turmoil around the world. So it's really interesting how this is going to unfold, but it's a nightmare scenario. But I did want your opinion on what do you think about this giant sunspot that's going to be rolling around here on the 23rd? And, wouldn't that be convenient that when everybody's rolling back the energy that we get something to blame part of it on, like, a mild CME or something?
Yeah, so many things are happening in September. See, I also had another message sent to me, and it would directed me over to somebody's Twitter feed with a couple messages in there. And it said, "You will never forget where you were on September 24th. And then I started to think about that for a second, in your life, moments in time where you were. Because my parents, they remember exactly where they were when JFK was shot or something like this. At that, if you remember exactly where you were, if you go back a couple generations, like they knew exactly where they were, and they heard the news about Pearl Harbor, they knew exactly what the hell. It's going to be one of those moments. You knew exactly where you were at 9/11. The September 24th was the same thing. You're going to remember where you were. So I'm thinking, what is that event? Now, if the global electricity stopped because of some CME that came rolling in, that would definitely be a remembrance. Not only would you have the experience of a power down because of the CME, but you would have the experience of something that large, watching that halo come in and electrify the atmosphere. To the point where you're going to see that hit and wrap around and then start trailing in like filaments of electricity or plasma as it would hit our Earth. If you had clear skies and you could see up to the stars, literally you would see a red coma come around the planet when that would happen. If you saw that dancing in the sky, and then you were let's say you're more north than I am, and you were somewhere in like northern Michigan or I don't know, somewhere like that, right at the border, you're up in Canada somewhere. Not way northern Canada, but down, right where the U.S. borderline is there, or more like Norway or something. You would see a full red coma come around the planet, and you would see plasma come down. Perhaps the ground to sky effect would occur, but where that plasma terminated, it would start dancing, and you would see the canyon walls come to life again, and you would go, oh my, I saw that on a canyon wall somewhere. If we go to that kind of knockout where you would remember where you were from a solar flare knocking out that much electricity, that's what you would see. And see, how interesting is that? We're kind of in this end times period where many prophecies are overlapping. The time scales, everybody's pointing to September, and every large economist that I ever watched, ever in the whole history of anything I ever knew finance, they're all 100% saying, yep, it comes this year. This is the end of this economy and civilization as we understood it. It's going to reassemble itself. There'll be a new monetary system. Society will shift greatly, but we are critically at the end of this thing. It ends this month. The beginning of the end of it is this month or whatever day it is, and it rolls for a couple months and everything's reset. So then add on top of it a massive solar flare that came in and made plasma petroglyphs dance around the skies. Then we have an event to remember. Because, thinking about events to remember, and I'm so glad you brought up a happy memory there about the Balkans for me, because I got to travel around Croatia. It was such an exquisite country. And I started to learn a lot more about that whole, I even went to the Czech Republic also. So I learned about the Czechoslovakia whole thing during the communist time, and the Czech Republic it gets dark like at 4:15, 4:30 in the afternoon. You got to drink honey mead to even like stay awake after 4 p.m. It's very dark in terms of like light, not a lot of light in the wintertime, because we went there just before and after Christmas, try to catch a Christmas festival in Prague. Same thing in Croatia, but Croatia was super, like energized and very light. So those two countries are very different. You think the more north would be more Christmassy because it would be Christmas. No, everybody's hunkered down inside and everybody's pounding alcohol. And during that time that the alcoholism was unbelievable. Like 60% of the dudes there, we're talking an older generation, like 50s, 60s, and 70s, like 60% of the guys were alcoholics. There was nothing to do. And they want to take Europe back to the same planned economy again, like the entire continent. This time, nobody escapes. Because what's so interesting is I didn't know this about the U.S. after World War II. They just sat there on a map and like pretty much threw darts and said, okay, that one's going to go to over the Iron Curtain over there. Okay. Oh, Austria. Oh, good call, man. That thing just banked left at the last second. Okay, that's going to go over to NATO. All right, throw. And that's exactly the way they did it. And when I saw like Slovakia and Slovenia and then, heading down into what was, you said the Balkans, stunning place. If you ever want to travel, go there. It's the most amazing water in the Adriatic Sea. And then I'll tell you another thing about plasma. I visited this place in India many years ago. This is like early 1990s when I first started traveling. I barely even had traveled before. And I went to India and we were cruising along the coast. And there's this place called Hampi, which is very southern India. And the entire place is made of these boulders that are exactly the same size. So if you go to a beach and you scoop a handful of sand, pretty much all the grains of sand are about the same size. And you notice it, like everything's pretty uniform. You might get one big piece here, one smaller, whatever, a shell. But it was the same way, but boulders the size of your car or the size of a room in your house that formed mountain ranges as far as the eye could see. And then they had these old legends about what you consider off Western India, a plasma strike out there that sent all these boulders up. And go over to Croatia and see the same thing. Instead of having red sandstone boulders of the exact same size making mountains, instead of that being red sandstone, this time it was that sort of white limestone, or that what you would see across Greece and Italy on the hillsides where they're growing olives, that kind, but in the exact same grain sizes. So we were in a place called Rijeka, and a little bit further, if you go to the Istrian Peninsula, they have this old town up there called Pula. If you stay in Pula overnight, you can go to this old Roman Colosseum, and there's literally nobody there, literally zero people. And you can just sit in there and drink wine, and there's nobody there. And you got this second largest Colosseum on the entire planet, but zero people were there. And I was like, what is this place? So anyway, when you get there and you start taking the bus and you head down, you start to see the same exact thing. This ionized, I am absolutely unequivocally stating the Adriatic Sea was sculpted by a plasma bolt from another planet or whatever, however that works outside our planet, electrically interacting to cause that, what you consider lightning plasma, to come and sculpt out the entire Adriatic Sea and blow the different same exact size particles. Now, if you could see where the trajectory of that wind would go, on the ionizing wind, it's going to go a certain direction. That's why you see that shock pattern that forms when everything cavitates back on itself. That's Andy Hall's work on understanding the blast patterns and how that supersonic wind sends the channeling. And you see also ridges within mountains that look like sort of dinosaur scales going up the side of a mountain, all in the same direction. That's all that supersonic wind. But when it gets to that point where it back drags on itself, it leaves those little tiny circles. Think about this. We always talk about Göbekli Tepe and how it was perfectly buried, and they knew it was buried. They said it was buried by humans because everything was the exact same size of the soil, and it must have been a sacred site because it was so perfect, or every size of grain of whatever soil was put back in, it was almost like it was filtered and filled in. They were so amazed by how everything was so uniform the way it was buried. we'll take a different tack. What if Göbekli Tepe, functioning religious site at the time, that arc of plasma sculpted out what was flatland, not an Adriatic Sea, all the way down to Turkey through Greece, sculpted that out, and that ionizing wind from that distance would obviously pile boulders right next to the Adriatic Sea, which we drove by for hours and hours and hours. And I mean, like 3,000 feet tall of these boulders, all the exact same size like I saw in India that time. But if you go several hundred miles, you're going about 400 miles or so, 450. Instead of being boulders where that ionized particle strike was, it would be grains of sand. It would be soils that were exactly the same size. They would have flowed over, just like sand dunes do. You know, they find that thing buried on the side of the mountain. Perfect. Would you remember where you were if you saw something like that? Because September 24th is the 50-year Jubilee, the Shemitah, if you believe in such things of cycles of allowing debt to be absolved and start completely over. Let your land lie fallow for a year. September 23rd, the autumnal equinox, or for the autumn equinox. September 30th, Vatican has all gold, silver, and equities and anything liquid asset that can be sold at the moment, brought back to the Vatican Bank, firewalled from the rest of the system. The 15th, UPS goes on strike and grounds its entire air fleet. Problem is, the U.S. Postal Service uses UPS aircraft in conjunction to move mail around the planet, mail around the United States, boxes. And at the same time, the railroad's going to go on strike too, because their arbitration cool-off period is finished. They think that Biden will make an executive order where they can't go on strike. But so many of them are sick because they all had to get forced vaccinated that they're barely running right now. And everybody's retiring. They're all sick. And this is the problem. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. You couldn't train Ransom and I to go run a railroad in like weeks or months even. It takes years to get that training, especially around all that heavy moving equipment. Geez, that's just an accident waiting to happen. And accidents really frequently happen, even with 30-year veteran running the yards out there. So I don't know, Ransom, it seems like a very big and crazy, incredible month, and a lot of things happening that are going to define history in the next 30 to 60 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what you were talking about, these plasma things make a lot more sense now that the James Webb telescope pretty much has proved that the Big Bang Theory never happened. Because they started looking out there and they realized that, they had flawed equipment before, and now they're seeing that it's an electric universe and there may be no end to it, the way that people thought that it started, kind of from a singularity and then moved out. Those concentric circles that go around the electromagnetism of different things show up on different stuff. They just photographed a star that is pretty much has that around it. So it's kind of really trippy. And then on what you were talking about, it was making me think of, and it's funny that you brought up Göbekli Tepe, because I was already on that train of thought. It seems like maybe 12,000 years ago or so, there was a civilization that got reset. And it might have taken some time. I don't know how long it took, but it took a while. It must have, to get rid of all of the artifacts, evidence, civilization type stuff, so that whenever civilization started again, there just really wasn't that much proof. And it seems like the same thing is going on right now. And you brought up Göbekli Tepe. That's an example of someone leaving writing on a megalithic monument, which is pretty unique because, as you know, most megalithic stuff does not have any writing from the builders on it. However, Göbekli Tepe does. It does have, an edifice. It has drawings on it, or, carvings on it. And it did relay some information from that time to the next period. And it seemed like for whatever reason, they knew they needed to bury it, to send it into the future. But how that relates to right now, it seems like for the past 20 years, the governments of the world have been actively trying to not only destroy the ancient history that we found, like Sumerian things. As you know, ISIS has gone around blowing up all of these old Buddhas and all of this cuneiform text that's on walls and on monuments. God knows how many tablets have been seized and then stolen since 2003 and put in private collections. So all of the ancient stuff is disappearing, and now we're getting rid of the kind of the old world, but recent empires, because you have to get rid of those older empires if you want to start a new one. Obviously, so it seems like they're selling out Europe and all of its, long culture and history, and trying to just erase that from memory. And it probably would only take a couple generations after a new system was put in place where the young adults wouldn't have any idea of the previous world at all, because everything had been either erased by collapse or erased on purpose, just destroying it. And think about it right now. If you've ever seen one of those man on the streets interview people about factoids and stuff, and I've been watching a lot of those, people don't know anything. They're really uneducated on about everything, which is very scary, because if the lights turned out and the internet turned off, then everybody's basically blind and deaf out there and doesn't know how to do anything. And the last couple generations, I would say right under my age group, which I'm about to turn 45, they don't know how to use tools. They don't know basic math. They don't know basic geography. Things that you took for granted in grammar school and elementary school are things that they don't know. And some of these people are actively enrolled in higher learning colleges across the U.S. So it's a really scary thought that I think it would only take about 20 years. That's something that has been the number for a long time. And there's been several famous people say, I don't really care about what your politics are or what you want to vote. I just want your kids, because in 20 years we'll run your country. And the same works for replacement migration. In 20 years, if the new population has been having more children than the old population, it's a simple math equation that the original population is gone. I mean, it's really bizarre that now people are denying that that's happening, but at the same time, they want to remind you that the old empires like England and the colonizers did exactly that. So I don't know why it's a conspiracy theory now that there's replacement migration, when people want to point it in your face all the time that the colonizers did their own replacement migration. I mean, think about it. We colonized the United States and basically wiped out a good large portion or percentage of the indigenous population, and we populated. So we replaced their population with a new European population, and then people started coming from all over the world, which made us pretty homogenous, and that started working out. And people from all over the world wanted to come here for the idea of individual freedom, the freedom to protect yourself, the freedom to ideally have a free market in which someone could go from someone broke to someone that's in the middle class or even rich if they were focused and did a business and people liked it. But all of that's being erased. You can't do none of that. That's the whole reason that you were trained in the last 2 years, that we're going to shut off your mom and pop's businesses and you're going to have to stay inside. But think about that. What do you think about what I was saying? They're setting up a scenario in Europe by turning off all the power, that they're going to force people. What do you think people are going to do? You think they're just going to sit in their house and freeze? No, they're going to get out on the streets. And what you've been seeing as the farmers' protest is going to increase to the general population. And that is going to turn into lots of people in the streets in a French Revolution style. If they're smart, they will go after I'm not promoting this idea. I'm just saying it necessarily is going to happen. If people don't have power and there's no power at their job and there's no, comfort at all, that makes people hungry, irritated, and they want to blame someone. But I doubt that the people or the members of the World Economic Forum are going to be the people that take the brunt of it. It'll be the local officials and stuff, and things will just start collapsing. Especially if your local official has already been brainwashed that the people are out to get them. Wait till the people really are out to get them, and they're not going to show up for work. So that means further collapse of civilization because nobody's going to be working or keeping things running. And you can kind of see that that's been developing with the yellow vest and different stuff for 20 years now. It's got to come to a head, and they know that. And this is the perfect time for financial pop at the same time as turning everything off.
What if I were to take that a step deeper in the next, say, 8 minutes? So with the extreme cold coming in without access to heat in the homes, how do you think the African refugees or Middle Eastern refugees or whatever it is that live in a warmer climate refugee that has made their way to Europe, how do you think they'll fare when the heat turns off? Because the way I was looking at it also, talking about these 400-year cycles and this grand solar minimum, as it's called, sun steps down in a 400-year low of solar activity. Jet streams, cloud cells, they go out of their normal flows, things bunching up, and then we got all these new clouds because of the cosmic rays. So now we have 3 sets of variables squeezing out and ringing out in the wrong places. But other flows are going to start. So if things are knotted up somewhere in the atmosphere and it creates its own new knot or heaviness or bubble or whatever you like to call that pressure dome, once that sets up, then other flows start to move around them. Now, if you knew what the new setup would be and where the new flows were going to go, you could set up new agricultural areas in Northern Africa, the Sahel, these different areas of Africa that you could also enjoy the natural above ground rainfall increases because of the blocking patterns from this new magnetic field, allowing our atmosphere to move differently. Now, if you'd studied several of these cycles, you know exactly where once this place locks off and starts blocking high, it's going to push moisture. Now, you could look at the North African monsoon for an example on a 4,600-year cycle. You can look at the West African monsoon on the same 4,500-year cycle, and it's getting really wet across all those northern African nations. They got record crop production. Now, see, if you go further down, you don't have all the natural precipitation because of that shift yet. It'll be another 100 years or so. But you could tap the Nubian sandstone aquifer and all the different aquifers that are under Africa. 100,000 cubic kilometers plus of water resources directly under the feet. That with innovation from Europe and the United States could tap that and just flow it, and unbelievable production could be gotten out of what we consider the Sahel, a desert now, or Northern Africa, which is increasing in grain production naturally just from the above ground water and the new rainfall patterns setting up. Problem is, you hit it on the head. Ransom, they'd been there before. The white colonizers. They'd stolen the resources. They'd enslaved people. Not me. Don't blame my generation. I wasn't alive back then. Nothing to do with it. That was the ideology of the day, which thankfully it has changed since then, because I don't believe in that either. But the way it was done back then, the colonizers rolled in the 1700s, and they said, you're going to produce this, and they've been through that road before. You produce this rubber, you dig for those gems, you do this, you do that, go get the gold, go get the ivory, whatever. The list is deep. Unfortunately, how that place has been pillaged. But then you bring it forward, they're not going to have that again. Even if the world needs to set up a new grow zone and Canada goes offline because, generally in grand solar minimums, anything 45 degrees north latitude and above and 45 degrees south latitude and below to the Antarctic, generally they just don't produce nearly as much. Usually there's like a 90% plus decline in agricultural productivity. It's So then you get those periphery zones like 40 degrees north and 40 degrees south, and they're just, they're productive, but they're not, like they were before. They just gargantuan declines, probably, 30% knocked off that. And then you come down and you finally get some stabilization zone around 35 north of 35 south. Okay, that's a huge amount of grain production in the modern world, from Kazakhstan to Russia to United States to China, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Argentina. Okay, that's a huge amount of stuff to take offline food-wise. So if you knew the weather was going to shift based on magnetic field changes on a 400-year grand solar minimum cycle, you would look for a new grow zone. And the new grow zone would be Northern Africa. But you got to think like the planters would. They've been there colonizing at least once that we know of, probably twice. And it even since that point, like say 1700s, it would change. It would be a Dutch colony, and then it was a German colony, and then it was a French colony, and like each one of those went through that change of leadership role for whatever white colonizer was down there. So they understand their past really, 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 really well. And they're willing to die that doesn't come back again. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts. They're going to be the resistance army. The men were going to be. The men were. You know how many men have left the African continent to go to Europe? 10 million. 10 million. That's the largest standing army on the planet. But they're all up in what is about to be collapsing, freezing, absolute bone-chilling, zero temperature, no heat Europe through the winter. See, if you're looking at these parasitic entities that seem to have control of the planet for the moment, that's a two-bird, one stone there. They take down Europe, bring it into communism, but at the same time, wipe out an enormous amount of the refugees that had come up there. They ain't going back. Let's say that. They're never going back down to their home countries of Ghana, Togo, Benin, whatever, Mauritania. Nope, Chad. They're not going back. That was a one-way ticket to disarm. Now it's just women and children and no economic activity. And imagine if they rock in, you could double crop that entire zone. Imagine how much infrastructure you need to lay out there. What the boon that would be to start rebuilding an entire grow zone on the top 50% of Africa, the largest continent on the planet. And just your company got the contract to go build part of it out for the water irrigation. Your company got for the wiring of it. Your company got for laying the roads. Your company got for the fuel distribution. As we go through this collapse, they're going to need to start somewhere again. Because there got to be confidence that there's going to be money made from a company so people want to invest into it or even go to work. Or even buy something because they might want to save their money for tomorrow because if it's not going to improve, why would I spend my money today? Like we go down to the very basicest thing here, like you're going to buy a loaf of bread or you're not. Because you could save that old stale bread and rehydrate it through like a bamboo steamer, or you go buy a new loaf of bread because it's going to be better tomorrow. Like that's how deeply it goes. So when we get to that point, which we will here shortly in months from now, then what? You're going to have to rebuild the world and start it somewhere with a new catalyst, a new spark of financial life. That is going to be the Sahel in North Africa. And I'll just leave it there because I never would have thought of that until you said the colonizers. So, Ransom, I'm glad you brought that point up. That's exactly what's happened. I'm actually going to be talking about this on Brighteon TV next week when I go up with Mike Adams in the studio there. These same concepts of how many people are going to be wiped out on purpose because of the cold, who's not used to the cold. It'd be no difference in somebody who weighs like 400 or 500 pounds and then you put them down in Equatorial Guinea or you slam them in the middle of Indonesia in the middle of summer with no AC and they just have to exist in like the middle of Jakarta. There's no way they would die for sure. The extremes that the bodies aren't used to. I'll be right back with Ransom, Godwin, 420 TV, Freedomist Films. We're on Rumble tonight. Hopefully we can get the Rumble link inside Revolution Radio chat box. So here we go. We'll be back in 2 minutes, 2 seconds to continue the conversation.
Right back after this message.
This is Thomas, a.k.a. a Mad Painter. I'd like you to join me Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Open Canvas. Don't forget to bring an open mind.
Yes, folks, that's right. Bring an open mind to an open canvas. Again, that is Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern. UFOs to government corruption. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Are you interested in the paranormal? Murder mystery? Real natural law? Do you enjoy interviews with amazing guests? Then join Crypt Rick every Monday night, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on Revolution Radio. Studio A, freedomslips.com. Crypt Rick's I've been thinking. Welcome to the Crypt.
Join me at Revolution Radio, Studio B, at 11 a.m. on Saturday for Free Association, when we take a look at philosophy, spirituality, psychology, social issues, and geopolitics. It's every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern on Studio B at freedomslips.com.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Galactic Interstellar Council on Revolution Radio Studio A, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Join us as we traverse the starseed paradigm, as expressed in the time-space continuum that we know as the divine expression of love and light. Integrating this conscious unity into the galactic paradigm. So welcome all, both terrestrial beings and galactic beings as one. So be it. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. All right, thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And now we're going to get back to your host.
And welcome back for the second hour of Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm right here with Ransom, Godwin, 420 TV, Freedomist Films. You know, talking about how new grow zones may be set up And is this really a reset that has gone on many times before, where the history has changed after the reset? Because I'm still of the volition that as the electromagnetic fields shift going into 2024, when we get that second toroid looping magnetic field between the outer solar system and our sun, with the Earth in the middle, I really believe there's going to be something strange happen with the crust. There's going to be a lot of pulling, rifting, shifting, things that bridges, for example, railroads, conduits, pipelines, water pipelines. You've seen a lot of water pipeline breaks these days. Those are the kind of things that will be affected in the top, 1 mile of the crust or so with this new looping field. So things might squeeze out like toothpaste across the surface of the Earth, anywhere from 3 to 10 to 15 feet deep in some places, which would bury, imagine a 100 square mile area that, something oozed out of the Earth, and by the time it solidified and reached the outer areas, it was only 3 feet deep, but right where it oozed out of the Earth, it was 15 feet deep, and it buried buildings. I mean, Ransom, before the break, you talked about, what if there was a previous civilization at the Younger Dryas impact? There had to have been. They were coming out of the Ice Age for, 5,000 years they were coming out of the Ice Age. From the really, really, really cold period, breaking out of that, again, what causes a shift out of the Ice Age into this warming period we experience right now? And what shifts us back into? It's got to be electromagnetic for sure. But you need the magnetism to take the electric current. So, I mean, they're intertwined, literally, field-aligned currents. But what about that? What do you think that society, where would it have stemmed from? Because you got to think there was a previous interglacial about 118,000 years ago. So the exact same conditions that we experience right now were experienced 100,000 years ago, plus this 10,000 years. So think about our civilization, how far we've supposedly come, quote unquote, in the history that's been given to us from, 3000 BC or even the year 0 to the last 2,000 years up until today. That's a lot of accomplishment in 2,000 years. Now, they literally had the same brains, same bodies. You never would have known they were any different other than, no, you wouldn't have. They're exactly the same as we were. Had 10,000 years of warmth, 110, 118,000 years ago. Let's put it in that range. If something were to survive that, if something happens now, our civilizations are going to be pockets of people who live through it, and they're going to bring something back up again, some sort of civilization out of the ashes, if you will, as the Earth slips back into an ice age again. That's the same society I say survived from the last ice age interglacial that came all the way to where, it was coming out of the ice age, and then boom, that cometary impact right there on the ice sheet. See, that was something that probably didn't happen during the last ice age or the previous two, that they were able to carry some sort of civilization from one ice age interglacial to the next. The 90,000 years in ice, they were still there. They just shifted. They morphed. They were down near the equator. They were further, whatever. But this society still exists and true, whether there is an ice age or not. Population is going to be different. But the same society you're referencing at that Younger Dryas, which disappeared, and then what? How did they disappear all their history artifacts and megaliths? I think in our modern society, a megalith would be an under-highway support structure, like one of those gigantic concrete things that's holding up the highways, like an 8-lane highway in California or something. If those were to collapse down and 12,000 years later, you would find those. So I don't know. Revolution Radio, thanks for letting us talk tonight, because I know this would have already been banned on YouTube. Consider a donation, freedomslips.com. And what do you think, Ransom? What would they really find from our civilization? We talked about this before, but could the history be erased so cleanly? A global liquefaction event like we're going to see here coming up 2024-25 with magnetic field alignments. I mean, could you erase the entire history of humanity in less than 400 years and reset it every single time? I mean, is that even possible, to destroy everything in 400 years and put a whole new history and leave some of the stuff that fits the narrative just in place to be found? Or have your bought and paid for archaeologists find it and then put out what they were told to put out in their timelines, compared to what you're finding, which is way different. So welcome back to the second hour.
Yeah, that's a really trippy thing to think about. But I think it's the cycles keep getting smaller every time they reset. So something like 12,000 years, 5,000 years, 2,000 years. But each time they seem, like you said, they can't wipe it totally clean. Now, something happened, I'm saying 12,000 years ago, where they had advanced technology that seems to be a little bit further than what we're allowed to have right now. But let's put that aside for a minute and talk about how long would it really take to erase a society. And when we left off on the break, you were talking about not only the colonization of North Africa and, you know, different places by Europeaners, but it was going back and forth for several thousand years. There were several Muslim conquests, and then you go back further in time, you had the Greeks and the, what were they, the Syrian, not the Syrian, excuse me, the Persian army. And they came in and they took over and they changed things and etc. So this has been happening, and human beings won't face the fact that the way that the earth works and the amount of changes that it goes through in cycles, that human beings cannot survive on earth by staying stationary. Throughout all of history, there's been human migration that's had to move because of climate change, because of droughts, because of whatever, famine, etc. But now you come into a time where it's more engineered, and this is the kind of circles back to when they're resetting this time. It's got an agenda that's different than the last several times. So this time, I disagree with you a little bit about the way that the population would react to these winters, because you got to think about this, that the population dynamics of Europe right now is that the, like the French, the Italians, the Netherlands, etc., the majority of their population is on the elder years side, and they're not having that many children. So these military age men are coming from all over. They're coming from North Africa, they're coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. When you look on the U.S. border, the same thing's happening. The majority of people that are coming over now, according to the Border Patrol, are OTM, that's other than Mexican. That means that they're coming from all over the world: Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, et cetera, et cetera. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. These are like a medium-sized city coming across the border constantly. And then you go back to Europe and you think about, they have even smaller populations with a more elderly population, because they're kind of on the golden years. A lot of their people decided to only have one or two kids, and that allowed them to retire, work less. The golden years are over. So they're telling everybody that the comfort is over, and then they're filling up millions of people into these areas. So what happens is, you think that some of the people, probably won't be prepared, and they'll still be homeless, and they'll riot and things like that will happen that are coming from other countries. But a big portion of them are going to survive because they're young, healthy, fit men, versus the populations that are already in those countries, which are more elderly. And now you turn off the heat and you turn off the power, and we already know this happens whenever grids go down and things happen. The elderly die. They die when it's barely a little bit hotter than they're used to. They die when it's a little bit colder than they're used to. So that eradicates a big portion of the population. And then in 20 years, you have a totally different population. And now and this goes off into some pretty sinister things, because you think about when the population in 20 years is different, most of those people do not own deeds or hold land, because they're not from those countries. So unless they bought it recently, they probably have a mortgage or a deal with the bank or whatever. And that's the one thing that's going to remain in Europe, is the central banks. But meanwhile, most of the properties are going to transfer over to the banks from families that have had these farms and these houses and et cetera. And then when they have no children to take the land, of course, it's going to go back into the hands of the banks, which are going to resell all of this land to the new population. So they're making money hand over fist, except for there's only one problem going to be in Europe, is that you're going to have this idea of balkanization, which is so many different kinds of people that don't want to change to a new culture, that are in the same areas. You're going to have circumstances like we had in the breakaways, where Muslims are going to be fighting the Slavics, and Germanic people and different, they're going to have these clashes of what's left of the youth that are still in the countries. And then guess what's going to happen? It happens on a small scale is those remaining European families are going to move. They're going to move out. They're going to sell their land, which changes the total population. And then the voting changes, the culture changes. And then you get back to what I was talking about, that they start eradicating books, churches, historical stuff, to where the old world, the old empires are totally reset and destroyed. And they start these new places like we were talking about. This has happened, I don't know how many times. And you can think about it on a small scale, like the American city. They call it gentrification now, is what they call it. So basically, you had white neighborhoods that had new houses and stuff in the 40s and 50s, and you had black neighborhoods that had relatively nice houses, and they had their own booming economy that started going good, and they had nuclear families and things like that. But then all of a sudden, they offered welfare, and the nuclear family has been breaking down since Lyndon Johnson introduced basically welfare to the country, and the size of the ghettos that were in each city exploded. So the people, and then they took away the jobs, manufacturing stopped. So the people that still had a little bit of money moved out of those cities. The ghettos became bigger, and then later, all the property values drop to nothing. Nobody owns anything. And then eventually in time, people start coming back because they're buying up all the land that's now cheap because it's been destroyed and then brought back up. You could see that the banks are the constant, the money printers, the money manipulators. And you would imagine that each time that the world has reset, those are the same people. You can call them what you want, the elite, the Illuminati, the royalty. It's the people who have the gold because contrary to popular belief, I know there's a golden rule that comes out of the Bible to treat others how you would like to be treated. The real golden rule that runs this world is he who has the gold makes the rules. And it's so funny that I was just put out a documentary that was talking about how much gold they were finding in the Grand Canyon, and the banks were panicking that the price of gold would go down to nothing. And this was around the same time as they created, the creature from Jekyll Island, and we went into the central banking system, and our money has turned into nothing since it was based on gold. Now the gold market might have quit, but what's funny is there's a new phenomenon. I don't know if you saw that, but up in Iceland, or it's Iceland, one of the volcanoes there just spewed out pure gold, which is like a never seen before phenomenon. So that kind of tells you like what's going on in the earth, where one of these usually veins of gold that would fall down to the bottom when the water and whatever happens, because it's a heavier element, goes down to the bottom. What's going on inside the earth when it's spewing out, chunks of pure gold out of some streak of gold or vein of gold that's under the earth? You were talking a lot about the top of the crust shifting, and you seeing that in a real way, like people's water and electricity and things like that being cut off. It seems like the government is preparing everybody for these ideas. Look down in Mississippi, like they proved that, they could have fixed the water at any time within a couple days, but they just didn't, because government really doesn't care about you. So they just let the infrastructure fall apart. Go back to Katrina. They did the same thing. People warned that the levees wasn't going to hold and that the town was going to be flooded and destroyed. What happened? They ignored it. And then they let it be destroyed. And imagine all the millions of dollars, I would say billions of dollars of transfer of wealth of properties, because they were destroyed and the people didn't have the resources to build them back up, or they didn't have the insurance. The insurance companies and the banks were in cahoots there. Because, if you don't have insurance, you're not going to get paid. So the banks are coming up and foreclosing on all these properties that are destroyed. And then the local population, guess what? It got moved out. That's the same thing on a smaller scale. They made it the biggest ghetto in the United States. Then they destroyed it. They shipped the people out. And now they're all the banks are banking because people are now rebuilding and buying those same properties back up, which obviously will be destroyed again.
Yeah, every town sees that. It seems to be on like a 50 or 60-year cycle. Well, those old factory districts, nobody wanted to buy that land down there. Hey, it might have been, pollution, what we're finally understanding more about toxic chemicals, it was used for this, that, and the other. It was warehouses. It was a railroad depot. The train doesn't come anymore. It was an old factory. There's a cool smokestack, whatever. Oh, now those are like art gallery museum areas. Before it was a high crime area, and like you say, if you follow that same timeline, then say 1940s and 50s, and then it becomes really depressed value in the 70s, and then it smolders there until the mid 80s or mid 90s. People pick it up a little more, and then suddenly in these last 20 years, they're like, oh, it's a cool place. Let's turn this factory. Look at the large door. It's cool artwork, whatever. It seems to be a good 60, so over there, 46, not even longer. Hey, you know what? It's like an 80-year cycle. It's right on, exactly sitting. If you like Klaus and Schwab, if you're going to be talking about the 80-year cycles of boom and bust, that's exactly what it is. You hit that on the head. 80-year cycle. It mixes that. What you're talking about, gentrification cycle, is the fourth turning. Because it goes through all those cycles of, yep, that's it. So the gentrification cycle sits on top and rides on top of that. Klaus and Strauss, the fourth turning. So then you have to ask yourself, what other cycles are within that? Are there larger cycles of 400 years? So 5 of these turnings, or 5, like you said, reemergences of what was poor areas turn into gentrified areas, back and forth, where, because right now we're going to be dropping off the economy. So these areas around what we're seeing now is going to drop off into dismal, people are going to move out. Not going to be, you couldn't pay to stay there. You wouldn't. So these areas are going to go into that decay stage right now, but think about somebody in 40 or 50 years from now will start picking those up. We'll remember it as the crash. Areas abandoned, because what we consider now factory zones are put where they're not in the same downtown area where the factory zones were 100 years ago, 150 years ago, right along the river. Our new factory zones are way out in the country. So imagine in 60 years from now, they'll be like, whoa, it's way out in the sort of suburby in the country. Oh, there's a factory. It's a new art gallery. But it'll be more out into the suburbs in a country setting versus right downtown. It'll shift a little. But the same metrics will be employed through the media to get you to go there, spend your money there. Same existence. Because, one thing way back when you were talking, when you started talking about Pakistan and the floods back in the beginning of the first hour, I saw I've been looking at the satellite photos of the before and the after on the size of the flooding in Pakistan. It's massive. It truly is massive, unbelievably massive. But when you look at a wider view of what's reflooding, there were incredibly vast drainage deltas from an entire continent coming out of there. It's been dry for, 4,000 years going on, the last 1,000 years for sure, completely dry. That's Harappa Valley. That was a cradle of civilization 6,000 years ago. So back then, it was milk and honey forests, plains full of game, abundant fresh water, flowing everything. And what you can think of as has to be the perfect climate for a cradle of civilization, because then they have the free time because all their basic needs for food and shelter are met. So then they can go contemplate, think, and bring just hunter-gatherers up into the space age. And that's exactly what they were doing back then, too, a cradle of civilization. So is Mesopotamia. And now it's a desert. But when you look at these satellite photos where the water is refilling, you can actually see the contours of it flowing out through like a massive delta. Okavango Delta. Forget the Kalahari canals and that sort of thing that lead into the Okavango Delta. That would never have been a previous civilization that set out equally spaced 75 foot apart canals that harvest the water from the Okavango Delta and flow out and allow you to natural agriculture from the drainage of the Okavango Delta. You would never have that ability of a society, say 6,000. Oh, wait a minute. That's exactly when those were supposedly built. So how much of this history has disappeared? You know, we're watching this place reliquefy. That's the new pattern that's shifting over there. You should have seen the floods in Iran last year and the year before. They had areas that turn into inland seas. But today we would know as like estuaries leading out into the sea. So what we're seeing is a full continental shift happening in real time right now with cloud cells, jet streams, and new cloud building layers shifting along with the magnetic field changes, allowing all of this to move into different places. Well, where it's moving to and its final extent of movement has already been mapped out. So whoever's controlling this show already understands exactly where it's going to move to, how far we are into the movement. Is it another 3 degrees north latitude that it moves? Is it another 10 degrees, another 16 degrees, another 32 degrees? Who knows? But it's going to eventually get to that maximum movement point. And somebody, I guarantee you, somebody already knows exactly the latitude band that it will cease moving forward. And they've already mapped this out through, I'm going to say, millions of years, if not hundreds of thousands on the low end. These same societies have been here and ridden out all these ice ages in the interglacials. Some societies rebuild from the last interglacial, bring through, and just is starting to come out like Ransom was speaking about what got wiped out, what civilization at the Younger Dryas impact on the ice sheet. But 5,000 years prior to that, they were coming out of an ice age, and 5,000 years into the warming before that unusual event of a comet hitting the ice sheet in Canada, which creates the Carolina Bays. And they always have, if you look at the Carolina Bays, all those impactors are in the exact same angle and degree of latitude. And they never could find the impactors. It was ice. It hit and then it melted. These same societies are still here, because if things would have gotten completely wiped out at the Younger Dryas boundary era of an ice sheet cometary impact, we wouldn't be here with 8 billion people. So you got to think, if we went from a cometary impact 12,500 years ago, this is like really global temperatures dropped 20 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed that way for decades, plural, and there's a cloud layer enveloped the planet, but it finally dissipated. So you know that we went down to approximately 10 million. So the records state, and I can't, I don't have all the DNA evidence myself, and I don't have a time machine, although I wish I did. They said humanity got squeezed down to 10 million would consider breeding pairs. 10 million couples that could have children were the only thing left after that cometary impact. But here we are today, 8 billion people. So you got to think in interglacials, 90,000 years. 8 of those cycles could be wiped all the way back to like 5 million breeding pairs and then back up again, back down, back up, back down. It's a heartbeat, a breath. So it doesn't matter if you go from 8 billion down to even 20, 30, 100 million. It doesn't matter. Think about it as an off-planet species looking at the human race as nothing more than a vibratory creature to control to get emanating energies off of the being. Forget the physical flesh. You want to affect the mind so it vibrates at a certain frequency. That frequency comes off and it's food or harvestable for another species. That's what it's looked at. So it doesn't matter. The earth will just keep rebounding. So who cares? See, that's the way I'm starting to look at these things is, we're in this contraction period. It's meant to put off a vibration for some entity to feed off of. It's almost like the earth's being harvested, liquidated, and everything is getting ready for the petri dish to be cleansed and started over. But I'm wondering, this juncture of reset, not in a nefarious way, although it is, for not warning the people. The 400-year cycle, knowing that it's going to impact exactly these years and start these years, there would be famines anyway. So knowing that this present civilization wouldn't be salvageable in its form just based on natural cycles. The liquidation process begins to keep some wealth and extract some resources for the continuity of government. So if you delude yourself and think this whole thing in Europe of shutting down all the smelters and everything metal across the base metals to just shut it down and lock everything in warehouses, if you think that is because of power prices, the power prices are deployed to get all that supply locked in place for delivery, not for your hands, for theirs to reset the new society. And you could play this game again and again and again every 400 years. Because even some of the older stories, I mean, you look at the Dutch East Indias Company, it's very much like Amazon. You know, if there were other devices for power or movement or capturing winds in a vortice form, you could make things move and spin faster. So perhaps the trade that we consider was 4 months really wasn't 4 months, and that was a story given to us. But you got to think about the same exact things are in play, whether they're super slow by going from ship 4 months over across from California to, I don't know, China back in the day. Slow boat to China literally comes from that 4-month journey to go across the Pacific. Or from the British Isles over to the America, which used to take a month. Then there was the trade. Then there, you know, it's very much the same thing, all the global trade. But at that point of collapse, and you look across the world, 600, or let's say 1600s, excuse me. What do we really know about the world? We know that the same kings, queens that we're talking about today that just shifted the queen to the king is back in power again. Things are destroyed. Antiquity removed. Like, you think about a full collapse, who's going to be going back to the desert to see the Buddha ruins that the ISIS crew blew up in Afghanistan? The 3 largest standing Buddhas that they carved into solid rock. There was the central Buddha, and they were carved out of solid rock, straight in, and on the pilgrimage, people come in and worship there. Not from the Islamic side. This predates that, 2,000 prior, 2,000, 2,500 years ago. So after this collapse here, it's going to be a big one, and it's going to take society back down. Now, see, this is the misnomer. Is it going to take it back down on a regular 400-year cycle reset, which we think was a total collapse since the Roman Empire, or is this just like a regular one and it's just a regular reset? Based on magnetic field changes in the whole cycle of the 400-year cycle. So boom, we collapse, okay. It's going to take 100 years or so for things to smooth out, and then what you remember moving forward with the thing of travel to start again, it'll take 100+ years. But there will be explorers at that time finding ruins buried in sand. But is it really 4,000 years ago that these ruins are buried in sand and these blown up, what were carved out of solid rock Buddhas? Oh, there were 3,000 years ago here. Or were they now? Or 400 years prior? Who writes the history? Because you got to think about it. This thing going through, the economy resets. Okay, maybe there's nobody that explores for 250 years from this point. When they get there 250 years from now, after things been sandblasted and no human intervention, that thing might even be covered by forest with the new weather patterns coming in. It might even have grass on what would be considered pyramid hills or tombs or whatnot. It might actually look like grassy knolls when you're walking over burial sites and like different man-made structures. Who knows? Oh, you found one. Oh, great. That's 300 years in the future. Because think about the ancient Egyptian explorers. When do we start to really hear about Egypt? Oh, Napoleon. So if you're using the 1600s date of going back 400 years to the last grand solar minimum, we really start to hear about Egypt as a place of historical and Mesopotamia. That all came from that French dude traveling around. Perfect timing. It's about 200 years. That's about 200 years, isn't it? Think about Napoleon when he went up and then they started digging around the Sphinx. That was 1800s. But that was 200 to 250 years from the 1600s. So if the same thing were to collapse, could history be hidden enough with new excuses given? Because if you follow the play that they've done so far, is the Smithsonian grabs any of the ancient antiquities, especially giant skeletons, and anything found that doesn't fit in tool and metallurgy and stonework and sculpting that we can't even do it today, even with CNC lathes. It's so off the hook that you would need plasma coming out to melt the stone instead of actually chipping it off. That's why they never find, and then you'd have to polish it afterwards with incredible high. I don't even know if you would be using a sanding disc at that point, more ultrasound that might mimic some sort of scrubbing substance. But that's what you need to do to get to the level of where they find these objects that have been sculpted, which is way above what we can do today. So, that was advanced. It disappears. What you see is what they let you see. In Egyptian Antiquities Museum, that's all they let you see is the same damn mummy you've ever heard of. The Tutankhamun thing, the gold, the mummy sarcophagus. Dude, that's all you get. The exact timeline. So then what are the other institutions? Nature magazine. Oh, they tightly control the peer-reviewed research about ancient history coming out. The digs. History is very sculpted and very curated for us. But I think we're at maybe 200 years is enough to wipe it completely clean. So Ransom, I've been rambling, man. I'm going to let you go. But that nomadic history of the last 7,000 years, and then suddenly, start planting corn and we need to stay in the same place. How many resets have there been? Is that the same story they tell every time we come into the 12,500 year cycle?
Yeah, it sure does seem like the cycles are shorter each time, kind of like what I was saying. It's ironic you talk about the 1800s because, I've been looking into studying Mayan and Aztec history. And for the longest time, it was perpetrated that Teotihuacan was an Aztec city. But it turns out it was just like the Great Pyramid in Egypt, and it was completely covered over. The Aztec barely saw a small portion of the city when they called it the City of the Gods. And now that there's been more dating on it, and we find megalithic, right about the time that they uncovered megalithic stones, they stopped digging because, that wasn't fitting in with the Aztec narrative of who built the thing. So it now turns out that Teotihuacan is a city built by an unknown empire about 100 years before the first Mayan city was built. They kind of given it the name Teotihuacanos as the people because they don't know who did it. Now the Aztec came later. They found small portions of it. They buried some of their artifacts and stuff there. They were really impressed with it. But it kind of makes you wonder, why is it exactly at that same time in 1806 that, an archaeologist finally comes along to Teotihuacan and says, hey, there's a big old giant city here. Let's start digging it out. They dig it out. That's the same time period they're digging out Egypt. And as anybody has actually studied Egyptian history, they'll realize that all of those sarcophaguses and most of the writing on everything, almost all of that is from the Pharaonic people who came along and also found the Great Pyramids. And that's they've been trying to hide that for a long time because they wrote all these Egyptology books. And the hieroglyphs and stuff are obviously came later because some of the creations that were made from the Anwar province and some of the artifacts that they find in the later Pharaonic tombs, they didn't make, but they came along and they carved it. They didn't even have anything that could like polish diorite down to a mirror surface. They didn't have tools that could cut these stones. So we kind of know that they found them, and then their later works are obviously mortar and smaller blocks. They cut the older blocks to make new monuments. We see the keyholes, the keystone cuts, and all of these things from not only South America, but Central America. You find it in Angkor Wat. You find it all over the places that have megalithic stones. It's this technology that can be identified that had no writing on it on these megalithic sites, no writing whatsoever. However, they did have some unique signatures of their technology, which is strangely shaped, trapezoidal pieces and these keystone cuts. And that right there is an indication that they had hardcore metallurgy because they were melting metal to fit into these keystone cuts to keep these giant blocks together. Because it seems like at whatever time period they were making that, there was a lot of geologic activity, and they had enough technology to build these superstructures out of megalithic stones that could withstand the shaking of the earth. And now you fast forward, what happened to that? We don't know, but these other civilizations came and they sat on it, and then they went, and their empire failed, and they disappeared. And then we come along with the modern archaeology that obviously does not tell the truth, because one of the key indications that there was something really big to hide is whenever the Smithsonian Institute got involved in archaeology in the Americas, in which they usually shut down everything. They shut down digging. And you notice that this is a worldwide phenomenon where the archaeological digging and research only goes to a certain point, and then they'll just stop, and it'll be decades and decades, almost 50 years before anything new comes out, because they want to sell books, they want to indoctrinate their story. But now we're coming to a time where it's very possible that the grids are going to shut off, and the grid equates to everyone's new cyberpunk life, where they live in these apps, social media, etc. This is where they're getting all their information. And if that just turned off, what do? Well, they get agitated. They're ignorant because they don't really know real world knowledge. And this is just a situation ripe for collapse. And we're also in that period, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of a glacial. If you look back, that's when all of the empires are falling. So we know we're in that time period. It's just a question of how. And it seems like the powers that be have been testing the waters in these small beta tests, like turn off the power here, lock down the people there, suggest a medicine that they have to take or they can't work. And then you get into today's headlines, and it seems like all of the major companies around the world, guess what they're doing? They're laying off people. And I thought it's not something I'm happy about or anything, but we did suggest for the last 2 years on these shows that there would be signs and signals telling us that that's exactly the phase we're in, in a crash or a collapse or the empire failing. When you start seeing people that are supposedly rich and should be happy because they're losing a portion of their wealth are just jumping off buildings, as you saw with the CEO of the Bed Bath & Beyond. And then recently we had a Russian oil tycoon guy either thrown off a building or jumped off a building. I'm not sure which, but it seems ironic that, that is happening now. And those are the people that are in the know crowd. The people, like you said, you've been starting to get calls. People are telling you stuff. It's because all of the indicators, signs, and, evidence is pointing to they are pulling the plug. And it's like a weird slow motion train wreck that's probably going to take 10 years to complete, because they can't have steps get out of order. They need this to happen and then this to happen. So first, you might have to have some destabilization, then the food, then the irritated people, then you let them loose, release the prisons, cut off the food, cut off the power, and then you're in the situation. Sorry, some stuff happened.
Yeah, the security apparatus has been activated. Everybody's going to need dogs, for security, for sure. Even if you got a little tiny one, you're going to need it, because dogs are real sensitive to things. Think about what else is getting shut off, too. Imagine if the internet goes off. So who has backup for the internet? It's one thing to think about. And, using very little electricity, a recirculating oil heater for winter. Because you can just plug that in your wall, runs at like 750 watts. But once that oil gets warm inside there, it's a radiative effect. So even if you unplug it, it'll still stay warm for 30 minutes. And you can heat up one room pretty warm with that thing. If you can really block off the drafts and, get that thing, you don't even have to turn it very high, 72, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. That'll warm your room up right quick. And then if you had a couple candles in there going, that place would be, toasty. You wouldn't even need blankets for sleeping. So what do you think, Ransom? Your dogs how sensitivo are they for hearing and picking up on other people walking around on your property or in front or hearing cars coming?
Our pit bull's pretty good at it. She's a little too enthusiastic about it, but it was kind of ironic. I'm talking about the collapse of society, and then it sounded like somebody shot off an AK real close to us. It was like pop, pop, pop. The dog don't like that. It started going nuts. So
yeah, dogs don't. I'm telling you, dogs don't like. Our dogs don't like it either. Every time they hear a shotgun or something, they're like, they come running back.
Good security system, and this with all realism, even if nothing happens, no natural disasters of any big proportion, say our money doesn't fail, and there's enough food, governments are still shutting off the power on purpose. So think about all the people that are just in the government's hand, and they're living or dying on these decisions. Like if you have insulin or you're diabetic, you're going to have to refrigerate that insulin. And it's, they're fighting in Congress about how they can turn a $3 thing and reduce it down to closer to $35 or something like that. It's outrageous. They make people pay like 200 or 300 times the cost of the medication that keeps them alive. And then, if the power keeps going out or someone does something to the power, we're living in that time. So this isn't hypothetical or theoretical. This is actually happening from Europe to the United States. They're turning off the power. Look at California warning about, and then you have natural disasters that the grid's not ready for. And if you studied this in the least, you would know that our country, our government has known that the sun could knock us out at any time. And all of the experts have told them that it's not a question of when or if, it's when it's going to happen. And they have done nothing to upgrade the infrastructure, meaning that, in my opinion, this event has been long in the planning. They've known that it's going to shut off at some point. They're going to shut it off. But guess who gets to be the rescuers when they turn it back on after a good portion of the population has taken care of each other, so to speak. So my advice to people right now is you need a generator. Generators are going to be impossible to get. You can still get some right now. Most of them are on back order. Supplies are limited already. But if you don't have a generator, guess what? You're not going to have refrigerated food. If you're diabetic, you're not going to be able to cool your medicine off, and things like that. And that's just from government interference in the power industry, making the power turn off. Now add all these other things that we were talking about, like CMEs and natural disasters of different kinds. And it kind of brings us to the point. I think they know that we are going to mutate into a new species. It's also not a question of if, it's when. And I think this will be at the same event. And I was reading an article that was talking about how every single astronaut so far has mutations in their blood, in their DNA, that they have changed. Now, what's ironic is they didn't say anything about testing those people's children or any children they had after, words. They didn't talk about that, but they did admit that all of the people that went into space got a dose of cosmic rays and had several mutations happen to them. Now, with a collapsing magnetic field and the sun burping off stuff towards us, it would be deductive logic to think that the general population around the world, especially if power grids are out and they're outside, like I'm saying, people are going to resort to going back outside if the internet's off, if the power's off. They are going to get big doses of these cosmic rays and also the mutations that come along with that, if that's not too woo-woo. And one other point, we've talked a lot about a nuclear disaster in the Ukraine, and I thought that there was a headline that was very ironic, considering the recent events at Mar-a-Lago, where they keep talking about nuclear secrets. Then it got turned into, well, it's only one paper about one country's nuclear capabilities, right? Now, if you know about what's been going on with Trump's and the Bidens and Ukraine and Russia, there's a whole lot of intertwined drama and stuff going on there. Business deals, billions of dollars being back and forth, depending on which side of that you're on. However, Ukraine just told the world that they are not ruling out a nuclear war. Now, as far as I know, the Russians took all their nuclear warheads back to Russia, allegedly. So you got to wonder, what does Ukraine mean by they're not ruling out a nuclear war? Does that mean that they are the nuclear power that maybe that document might be about, is the Ukraine having nuclear weapons of their own? And then you have to admit, we're back to dealing with Iran in a friendly way, backdooring, trying to get their nuclear program off the get it running. It seems a lot like when the Clintons had their guy go around, and then all of a sudden, these other countries started popping up with nuclear warheads of their own, because all of those other countries like China and India and Pakistan, they got a basic old school plan for a nuclear weapon. Where'd they get it from? Look into that, and you'll see that maybe this might all be planned and coming to a head, because we know that they could destroy the idea of civilization by 1, maybe 2, or even 3 nuclear bombs somewhere in the world would scare everybody into submission. And we know that 2058 or something like that has already been blown up, either in the atmosphere, underground, in the water, etc. We're all still here. The planet's not over. However, if you blew up a couple cities and you made everybody really scared and showed them, because Nagasaki and Hiroshima were not televised on the internet, and they weren't shown on cable TV. The closest thing really people got to see it are these grainy, black and white films of the day. And then maybe in Vietnam, when you saw people running down the street with half their body burned off from napalm, was just a little iota of what you might see if they actually, resorted to nuclear weapons in city areas. And I keep thinking about these empty cities in China. And I know that a small portion of the population, kind of people like us, newsies, researchers, people into that stuff, know about these empty cities. But really, I don't think the general population knows that there's just empty cities in different countries. And I wouldn't doubt that there's empty cities in like Russia and different places like that. And then you have here in the United States, you don't have empty cities, but you have massive ghetto-filled, Democratic-run cities that are already miniature failed states. So do you think that they would really care if they, let one pop off in Detroit or Chicago? Or so it probably wouldn't be Chicago, because, that's a lot of the organized crime connections in our government come out of Chicago. But maybe another city, like on the Southwest, you could close the entire Southwest off if you just popped one in Albuquerque or Phoenix or something like that. And then they would just say, oops, oh, well, this Pakistani or Iranian or South Korean or North Korean or whatever, whoever, I'm just saying, brought a suitcase nuke in the southern border, and because it was open and nobody was checking, and, oops. But that would knock the electricity out too, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it might. And then, like you said before, it'd be contained within the desert. So, how many nuclear tests have they done in the desert? So, one little tiny one going off wouldn't even make a blip of difference. And I'll tell you a story. In this last few minutes here, I went to this estate sale, and that's so interesting you talk about nuclear here. Went to this estate sale, and it was an old prepper from Vietnam War, and he had some old radio gear. I was interested to see if I could get a couple antenna or something, because I know a few radio guys. And I went to go to this guy's house, and lo and behold, I picked up a 1961 radiological survey meter, the OCDM item CDV-720, model number 3A. The Victorine Instrument Company, and that's spelled Victor, V-I-C-T-O-R-E-E-N, Victorine Instrument. This is from Cleveland, Ohio, 1961. Now, this thing works. So I changed the batteries in it. There's a zeroing function on it, and then you can test in different bands from 1 to 10 to hundreds. And there's even a calculation on the load for the voltage inside there and the amperage, that there's no like electrical interference or overloading on circuitry to give you a wrong reading. So I zeroed this thing out. And you got to realize this thing was set for 1961. Like, the amount of radiation in the atmosphere was zeroed at this thing in 1961. So if there was definitely, they were terrified of like U.S. and the whole Cuban Missile Crisis and nuclear thing in the 60s, this Cold Scare. It was the scariest time ever for nuclear. So anyway, this thing was zeroed in the 1961. So think about the amount of additional radiation, Ransom. Like this thing pegs every time we turn it on. There's no way to zero it really back down. Because it was set then, and there's been so many nuclear tests and explosions and this and that and leaks and Fukushima and Chernobyl and all these things in between that this thing is basically useless now. It can't really register. It's pegged all the time based on the baseline in 1961. So you can see there is more radiation, like you say, but then what? We're still here. So I don't get it. It's a spooky fear thing.
It's a kind of a thing that you can study a little bit into, because right here where I live in Alamogordo, for whatever reason, they say the first atomic bomb happened here, but it kind of happened a little northwest of us over a mountain range, so it's closer to Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. However, when they popped that thing, they had a nice big map of the radioactive fallout that came from a very small nuclear warhead in comparison to what they have now. However, it didn't, kill a bunch of people like right off the bat because they got radiation. What it did is it seeped into the groundwater in Rio Doso and, Mescalero Apache Reservation that's right next to Rio Doso. And all these little towns going northeast in the direction of the jet stream that was going on right then. So it blew all up into northeast New Mexico, and all of these places, even Alamogordo, the people that were living then, they didn't die right away, and they didn't like get sick from radiation poisoning or nothing. No, what happened is their children and grandchildren are now cancer clusters, and now they're recognizing this, and it's been proven that the families that lived all through this fallout zone in central New Mexico, from probably about Alamogordo, Truth or Consequences, all the way up to Tucumcari, were dosed with a small amount of radiation, but they kept living, and they married and they had kids and grandkids. But now those families are cancer clusters. So it's just another one of those things it takes time to see, and that relates kind of to the things that are going on right now with like gene editing, mRNA, et cetera, et cetera. People forget that, lab rats and bunnies and all of that stuff that they used for testing, those things have very short lifespans. So a scientist can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different generations in a small, couple year span of time. However, humans, we live, sometimes 80, 90 years old, at least 60 years old. We reproduce. So it would take 60 years. If you're counting someone having kids every 20 years or so, it would take 60 years to start seeing the effects of the genetic changes that are taking place, these mutations and different changes in the population. So it's not something that, and I think a lot of the listeners are worried that it's going to be like a single event and everything will be different tomorrow. That may be true in certain places on Earth, but the overall reset is going to take like decades to do, because they have so many different places to do it to with different plans. And there's just no telling with the technology that they have. And, they always got the scapegoat of the sun. They never wanted to blame the weather on the sun, but I guarantee you if the sun burped off a big CME and turned off a lot of the electricity and damaged a lot of the infrastructure, they would be pulling on that as a, emergency that they wouldn't waste. But think about other stuff. They can blame it on war. And recently the governments are pretty open to, and we've talked about this before a lot of times, they always have that ace up their hole. Excuse me, I said that wrong. They have that ace up their sleeve of the UFOs, because our government, it's not like in the 50s when they said it was swamp gas or Venus or you're kooky or you're crazy, and they did all that. Now they're just openly saying it. You know what? We have videos of UAPs, UFOs, but we're not going to, we were going to give them to you, but we're not going to give them to you now. But we will admit that they're not made by humans. And that's where we're at.
Not made by humans. Yeah, sounds like we could have the same conversation in 1915. The world events are mapping up exactly the same. We're in a reset again. We're at the juncture. David DuByne signing off for Ransom, Godwin. It's food this weekend.
Thank you for listening to Revolution